everybody, and good evening again. And this discussion tonight, which I'm hoping will stimulate a bunch of questions, and is going to be about the establishment of mindfulness. As you probably, we've all heard of the Sutta on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. One of the translations of that, the early translations, is that sutta is entitled on the establishment of the four foundations. So there's numerous suttas where the Buddha starts out his instruction of how to do a particular meditation method, and he says you should go to a secluded place, the forest or a secluded place. You should situate yourself in a posture which supports the meditation process. And then he says that you should establish mindfulness. So the interesting part about this is that, it's not just implied, it's explicit that you need to do something to establish, create the type of mindfulness that is necessary for insight meditation, vipassana, the concentration practices. And what's significant about that is that, we hear lots of talk about how mindfulness is like, a natural state of mind, that it's an inherent quality that we have, which may be true, but that's different than a sustained, stable form of mindfulness, which is purposeful in a meditation process. And that's what the historical Buddha is talking about. And his methodology, all of the teachings and methods are based on a psychology of causation, where we work to establish a series of conditions, and then those conditions allow certain mind states to appear. So part of the reason that we work to calm and concentrate the mind is establish basic concentration, where the mind is settled and calm, which then allows the mind to move into a more open awareness. That would be one illustration. So it's the same thing with mindfulness. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about some very simple aspects of the conditions that are necessary to have relatively stable and continuous mindfulness, in the sense of mindfulness in meditation. And the Buddha's model was that we should establish mindfulness. We should then be monitoring during meditation whether or not we have mindfulness, or its quality, its stability, that we should make adjustments to sustain mindfulness or improve its quality if it's diminished. And in many instances, actually completely reestablishing mindfulness because we've just become lost in thought, or we've become sleepy, and the energy's gotten so low. Okay. And I have a suspicion, actually it's more than a suspicion, it's become a belief about community practice. And this is it. And this is from working with, now thousands of people over 23 years, many of them on an individual basis. And this is my belief. My belief is that for many of us, when we first start practice, we have enormous interest and energy. And it may be because we're really suffering. And it also may be intellectual. But nonetheless, there's this enormous energy. So we take basic teachings and really work with them. And so we're excited about sitting down to do meditation. And we're excited about, well, what is the scope of mindfulness and what's possible with it? Not, all these different methods and theories in Buddhist practice. And then what happens at some point that unless you're a really committed student and reviewing what's happening in your sitting, actually kind of doing some outcome evaluation, like, well, am I having insights? Am I growing, bhavana? Am I developing? Which is, the whole intention behind the teachings. That kind of drops off, and that many people, in terms of their sitting, begin practicing primarily from comfort. So that you sit down and have a very comfortable sitting. It's very pleasurable. But if after the sitting, like an interview with a teacher, it's like, okay, well, tell me what happened. Like, what actually happened? Does your mind know what you just did in the last 30 minutes, or was your mind really awake and alert and connected and in relationship with the experience that was going on? What was the intention that you were holding and bringing to that sitting? And so a lot of these qualities start to diminish. And so people are having I think, a valuable experience in terms of stress reduction and comfort and overall quietness of the mind. But in these larger qualities, that from a Buddhist perspective, mindfulness in meditation is directed towards two large overarching goals. And they're simple. As both a student and a teacher, I'm always trying to go back to basics. And so these are quite straightforward. And they are that through mindfulness that we can begin to see clearly or more clearly what conditions, our thoughts, our emotions, our patterns of behavior, which ones lead to suffering and which ones lead to satisfaction and peace. So that mindfulness as a tool is working to either undermine or dismantle viewpoints, perspectives, reactive habits, thought patterns, emotional reactivities that point the mind into struggle, dissatisfaction, misery, and suffering. So that's one element that in sitting, like the sitting we just did, what elements, what conditions arise that push our mind, point our mind towards being dissatisfied, aversive, clinging, attached, identified, personalized. And then on the other side, what the mindfulness is being watchful for is supporting and actually constructing. The term is bhavana, is development, cultivation of perspectives, attitudes, qualities of mind, creating conditions which point the mind into balance, satisfaction, and peace. So, in a large perspective, you can take all of the different methods and they fall into one of those two big categories, either undermining or dismantling dysfunctional, unhealthy, unhelpful qualities of mind and reactive patterns, or the mind is looking for the conditions to support and affirmatively construct states of mind and structures that support us and point our mind into balance and satisfaction and peace. So those would be, like metta practices, gratefulness, compassion work, forgiveness, all of those things being brought into the meditation. So the point is that from a Buddhist perspective, mindfulness is purposeful. It's not generic, the kind of generic mindfulness that you hear about all the time now. Like, well, gee, I'm just aware of what's going on. In Buddhist meditation, mindfulness is purposeful, and it becomes the operating system for all the other theories and methods to work on. So if you don't have this baseline mindfulness, it's almost impossible to do the other practices. So what I'm going to do is just talk about 3 very simple ideas. I'm going to maybe word them a little bit different than we're used to. Hopefully that will create some questions in the mind, some novelty, some curiosity, but they're fundamental, okay? So the 3 elements. The first one is that in order to be mindful and for mindfulness to be established, and be present, the mind has to be awake and alert. Now, this just seems so simple. It's almost like a throwaway when you first hear it. But if you just think back to the sitting that you just had, and honestly ask yourself, what was the quality of my wakefulness and my alertness? I mean, was my mind really awake and really alert? And if it's awake and alert, it sees what's happening, it's in connection with, it's connected with the experience, it has a relationship with it. There's a brightness to it. And then when we focus on something, like when we focus on an anchor, when the mind is awake and alert, it sharpens the mind. So those things should be happening if we're having mindfulness that is of good quality, okay? So that comes from the amount of energy that's present and the effort to use the energy. So like during that sitting at the beginning of the sitting and then in the middle, it was like revisiting, well, what is the energy? And then if the energy is low, we have to use the effort to bring the energy up. If there's too much energy in the mind, it's just recycling, it's papancha thoughts. We have to bring the energy down. So the mind has to be awake and alert. It's a function of energy and effort, using that. And the other thing that it's a function of is interest. So I think it's incredibly important at the beginning of your sitting to actually recall what is your intention for sitting. Just sitting down to do what? To mechanically do a procedure that I've done 50 or 100 times before? Like, no. These forms of meditation are purposeful. They're designed to see, experience, which leads to insight. So recalling that motivation can be so helpful because that helps wake the mind up and then points the mind into what we're doing. So that's the first thing. It's a mind that's awake and alert, and it becomes awake and alert by having sufficient energy, by using the effort to modulate the effort, so the mindfulness is there, and actually being interested in these, what points my mind into struggle and dissatisfaction, and what points my mind into balance and satisfaction and peace, okay? The second thing, and the way I'm going to word this is that awareness is present that knows what is happening. Now, most of the time you'll hear languaging like, well, moment to moment or present moment awareness. And the reason that I don't like using that is that it doesn't emphasize strongly enough the key element, and that is that the awareness knows what it's experiencing. So mindfulness from a Buddhist perspective is, I like the term bare awareness. And the reason I like that is that it's just so clear that the message is that we're not adding anything onto the experience, including thoughts, conceptualization, projections, interpretations. So this is critical because This bare precognitive, pre-thought experience is going to be all body based. And because thought isn't dominating, controlling it, in other words, the ego and the sense of the self isn't directing and controlling it, it leads to spontaneous intuitive insight, which is why we call, while the alternative to Vipassana is, quote, insight meditation. Insight arises through a bright, alert mind being connected in relationship to what's unfolding somatically in the body. And so that encompasses everything. And we start with a conceptual model, which is all thought, of course. But you can take the most dense, potentially dense Buddhist idea like dependent origination. And that starts as thoughts, but as an experience, it is all somatic. So, just work through it. We have some experience with another person, and it has a feeling tone in our body of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I mean, that's actually an experience on the body. And then depending on what the experience is, that escalates up into desire or aversion, which is an expansion or contraction of awareness. The awareness is either reaching out for something and wants to grab it, or it wants to hold it off or move back from it. If that continues to move, we move into craving, attachment, so that we're starting to hold on to a position, or we're tightening to oppose something. And then the next step is we move into personalizing identification of the experience. And now it's about me. So we can describe all of that with words, but the actual experience, the quote, the bare, direct experience, is an actual physical experience of expansion and contraction, of temperature, heat, location in the body. And so that's the focus, at least in meditation, of the attention of awareness. And then if we can stay there, that generates spontaneous insight. And so the most obvious instruction that we hear all the time that supports this is, what is always the instruction about thinking? Don't go into content. Don't go into content. Well, if you're not going into the content of thinking, what are you doing? You're in bare or direct experience, which is somatic. Okay. So if the mind isn't awake and alert, the tendency is it's hard for us to have the attention in the body and to be really alert and awake and doing the kinds of things that we were doing in the setup. Well, where is it happening? What does it feel like? How much temperature? How large is it? It changes, it moves, beginning, middle, and end. That all takes a lot of energy for the mind to pay attention that way. The easier thing to happen, and this is what I was saying, my issue about community practice is, more often than not, what happens is that the energy drops. And so this kind of attention, well, where is something taking place in the body? Well, what exactly is taking place in that part of the body? Is there a beginning and a middle and an end to it? That just disappears. And then the mind starts kind of getting sleepy and really, really comfortable. And we frequently just kind of drop into this gossamer, comfortable, semi-sleep thing that, it's great, but it's not going to generate any insight. So if we're actually interested in using these meditation techniques to develop and cultivate our understanding of what leads to suffering and out of suffering and what leads to happiness, those aren't going to take us to that place. They're going to help us be comfortable, but they're not going to generate insight. Okay. And so this is all present moment, because the only time that the mind can know what's happening is while it's happening. Can only experience it directly while it's happening. Afterwards, it's a thought. It's a recollection. So the second element, the first one, is a mind that's awake, it's alert, which is a product of energy and effort and interest. And here we're talking about the mind, or the awareness, actually knowing what is happening while it is happening, which is a function of bare, direct experience. So the final one, the third one is, because I'm going to try to give us three things that we might focus on in sittings, is awareness that is, and I'm going to use the term non-reactive. And the term I think that you hear most frequently is non-judgmental, but it's much bigger than that. We're talking about awareness that is non-reactive, and to be really clear here, we're actually talking about not a mind which is not reacting to the reactivity that's taking place. Because we've all done enough meditation where we know that there are all types of habitual reactive patterns in the mind. There's habitual reactive thought patterns. There's habitual reactive emotional patterns. There's habitual reactive physical habits. These are, for most of us, deeply embedded. So when we're in sitting, a memory comes up, we just immediately have this reactive thing that happens. So when we say awareness that is non-reactive or non-judgmental, we're not saying, well, don't have that reaction, because it's habitual, it's automatic, it's mechanical. It's not being reactive to the reaction that's taking place. In other words, this is where self-judgment comes from, and anger and frustration. Oh, I can't believe I keep doing that. I can't believe that my mind keeps going there. I can't believe I keep having that reaction. So the non-reactivity isn't trying to suppress or deny or eliminate habitual patterns. That happens through seeing them over and over and over again through bare, direct attention, which is kind, and seeing into what causes that to arise, beginning, middle, and end. And then we have insight about that, and those habits start to change. So the non-reactivity doesn't have anything to do with trying to change, eliminate, mitigate, deny, diminish. It's to be able to stay present so that we can see clearly. Does that work? You know, the extension of that is equanimity, where the mind is balanced and just doesn't react at all. So these three elements are both the establishment of mindfulness, characteristics of mindfulness themselves, and things that we need to revisit while we're meditating to see if they're present. And then if they're not present, make some adjustments to get them back in order. You know, and there's all kinds of discussions about, well, how do we bring our energy up? How do we bring our energy down? All those things, which is another talk. But the fundamental idea of the historical Buddha is that we establish these fundamental characteristics that we monitor during the sitting, which means we have to recall, remember to do that, and then take steps to adjust if we need to adjust. So the question is, well, how do we do that? And I think the answer to that is found in once again a fundamental idea, this idea of bhavana, which is the purpose of practice is to develop. And the thing that drives all of our actions, our thoughts, what we do, is our intention. And that, that's the relationship with karma. So unless we have a clear model of what we want to do with our sitting, it's hard to have a clear intention. So the historical Buddhist said, and this is actually my favorite quotation, it's kind of the hardest message. But the historical Buddha said, I know of no other single thing so conducive to misery than an untrained mind. And I know of no other single thing so conducive to satisfaction and happiness than a well-trained mind. And so, this really is a training. And so reflecting on what do I want to do? What do I really want to do with my sitting practice? And do I actually want to do something like this? To be clear about establishing my mindfulness, monitoring it and adjusting it, not letting my energy go down, not falling asleep, not just being comfortable. Do I really want that? And then actually setting that intention. And then before you sit, or as the beginning, every sitting, the beginning, I remind myself of this. Like, why am I doing this? I'm doing this to see into the nature, the profound nature of my mind and how I relate to it pushes my mind into suffering or pushes it towards happiness. And that becomes one of the motivations for staying awake and being alert and experiencing barely directly rather than going into thought and being non-reactive. So it all fits together. But the reflection for me is one of the more powerful parts about this, because in my own case, and maybe it's just like an undisciplined mind, if I don't reflect on this, it's easy just to sit down and just start sitting and not recall those things and have them motivating me, remembering to monitor. So those are kind of my thoughts for tonight. And I think we still have, a little bit of time to talk about this and question. I'm really interested in your reactions to this, how it relates to what you're doing, your thoughts about it, and any questions you have. Okay, and I always say at this point, when I mention questions, I wasn't being rhetorical.
So Dennis, this is Phil.
Yes, Phil.
So I'm only saying this slightly tongue in cheek. This has been one of the most powerful lessons I've had, and you've depressed the heck out of me. And it's okay to laugh and smile because there's been so much learning, because I've been doing some reading, and I've been attending these Monday night sessions for about almost 2 years. And I realize that most of the time I'm just comfortable or dozing off and really not doing any of the three things that you've talked about tonight. And so basically what I've been is a relaxed, untrained mind is what it's all been. And so I guess all I can do is go back to the notes I've taken and reflect and create an intention and try and train my mind, but I'm starting to feel like I can't do this by myself. And where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah.
What do you think is my next step to move forward instead of just being dozing off and comfortable or letting my mind wander?
Yes. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts. The first one is that none of this is meant as criticism, right? I mean, what all of this is about is just like seeing clearly where we are and then moving from there. And I think this is real common. There's such a heavy emphasis. We've just been trained in the West, to read, and talk. So many people are book Buddhists But the element of like this really basic thing, like, okay, here's a teaching. How does that actually apply right now in my life, in this sitting? So that's the standard for me. I'm really pushing people to even read that way. Like, okay, like, how do I really operationalize this in my life? Because that's, the Buddha said, here it is, come and try it out. Does it make your life better or not? Well, that's the question. And unless we do this very direct thing. So, how our organization started in Sacramento was I taught beginning meditation classes for 4 years, and then there were enough people from all of those classes. I taught 3 classes a year that a Sangha developed. That's how it started. So I'm a big proponent of taking beginning meditation classes, so that over a 6 or 8 week period, just step by step each week, you work on something. So there's this continuity of experiential learning. And so that's the first thing I would look at. And I don't know if you guys, have a course like that. I think you do. We do. There's some really great online resources. So as I said, I think it never hurts to go back to basics, because even if you didn't agree with the suggestions I made in this talk, you can see how just taking basic principles of the teachings, and rather than making a huge intellectual project about it, actually taking the teaching and asking, what does that actually mean in my life and in my practice? Then you don't need books and books and books. You need fundamentals, and then your actual intention to explore them. So,
Well, thank you very much. And I did not take any of it as criticism. Thank you.
Cliff. Here, you got to turn your mic on, Cliff.
Okay.
So good thing I had it off with what
I've always thought that you sound better with the mic on.
That was really great. With respect to insight, you talk about insight happening spontaneously in a period of time during the intention and awareness through the process of meditation, mindfulness. And that insight is derived from the process, but do you go into, or can you go into with the intention prior to meditation with the expectation of having an insight on a particular thing? In other words, there's an intention with regard to either resolving something or having that hopefully be the insight that is the result of your meditation, or do you just allow whatever the insight is come naturally through the meditation?
So I'm going to give you 2 answers to that. The first answer is that the meditation process, the way it's designed, is not to focus on a specific issue. The focus is to understand the operation of the mind and how conditions shape and push the mind in one direction or the other. So that the thinking is that trying to direct that process actually undermines the insight process. Okay, so I think that's the general answer, and I think it's true. Now, having said that, I think that we're now moving away from, like, here's the instruction on traditional sitting, a sitting practice. and we're moving into something else, and I'm not quite sure what to call it, but we're using mindfulness and the meditative process more exploratory to engage in problem solving. So I had a practice for years that I hadn't had anybody else. I hadn't read it any place, and then I read just a very little clip. It was like 5 paragraphs from Joseph Goldstein, and he was doing the same thing. So then, of course, I felt brilliant. So, and basically what it is that, and this is what Joseph said, he said when they were creating the forest monastery, the forest study project back at IMS, that what he would do is, there's cognitive insight, and then there's intuitive, meditative, or contemplative insight. So, we've all heard the story, and we've all had the experience. You work and work and work, your mind's exhausted, you walk away from it, you go out for a walk, and boom, everything comes together, right? That's cognitive insight. So what Joseph said that he would do is, he would work on this for a long time, and then he would sit just like for 10 minutes, but he would just hold the open question of like, well, what would be helpful in relationship to this part of the project I'm working on? It's just holding an open question, and then just doing the meditation process. And then surprisingly, the majority of the time, something helpful would emerge from that. So I think that's for real. I do that. I do it fairly regularly. I find it very, very helpful. And I'm really, really clear that that's not my regular sitting practice. Because, the problem is your mind will co-opt anything. And if you started doing that as your regular sitting practice, then it just turns into relationship meditation. And because the danger is that the traditional meditation practice is not based on an exploration of the self, in the sense that it's a psychology of self. This is a psychology of causation. What conditions point the mind? Where you can say, well, I'm going to sit down, and what would be helpful in this relationship? Well, immediately, it's an I, me, mind meditation. I mean, even if a lot of selfless stuff comes out, it's still, so that grounding of the starting place of the theory of what you're doing is different. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So Gwen, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, it kind of got answered, at least in part, by what you just talked about. But it's like when I'm doing the meditation, how does this intention relate to what is happening right now? Right, that's the question. But then I think, well, what if, physically, there's nothing happening. The room is lit, it's warm, maybe I've got a dish I need to bring. So you're talking about the internal landscape, of course. It just sounds so simple. I'm sort of embarrassed to ask it, but yeah, I just want to clarify that. You're talking about how does that intention relate to what is coming up internally in my meditation?
Yeah. So, and so, this is also fundamental. There's no stupid questions, right? Because a lot of it seems like it's counterintuitive because we're always intellectualizing everything. So, the Buddha laid out in this talk, and there's whole books on it, what he called the 4 establishments or 4 foundations of mindfulness. And so when we're sitting, one big field, they're like fields of awareness. So one big field is our entire body. and everything that's happening in our body. And interestingly, it includes our mind as a sensory organ, not as a thinking organ. So sometimes you'll be lost in thought, and if you pull out of the thought, but ask yourself, well, what does the mind actually feel like? This papancha, where we're constantly, it's painful. Your mind feels tight. There's no spaciousness. And so the mind actually has feelings. So the first foundation is the entire body. The second one is the feeling tone of the experience. So whatever happens, a sensation in your knee, the taste in your mouth, the sound that you hear, all of our sense doors. And so you can say, well, not much is happening. Well, a lot can be happening if we're paying attention. So, well, what is the intuitive response to that? Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And this is a fascinating thing. This is a whole other talk, but the first time I heard, this is a long time ago, the Buddha's explanation about that as the start of everything. Because what precedes desire and aversion is this intuitive response. And if we can kind of get a hold of that, it's the precursor to where our mind's going. So for an entire year, my practice was pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I mean, like every single thing. And it was shocking because, of course, my mind was telling me, oh, like, how simple is this, right? I mean, like, how tough can this be? And then what you find out is, well, like all kinds of sensations are happening and you don't know what your reaction is. And some things that you've been thinking are really pleasant actually aren't pleasant at all. That you've been doing them because the mind is trying to compensate, like eating or drinking or something. But if you actually go to the experience itself, it is not pleasant. It's distracting. And so the third one is all types of emotional and mind states. So think of all the emotions: desire, aversion, frustration, anger, all these things as they're manifesting in your body. And then there's a fourth one, the one that I really think is applicable to sitting is this dependent origination that I was talking about. So even the simplest thing that comes up, you can watch the conditions. What is the beginning? Was it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? Did it move into desire? Is desire present? Well, now is there craving? Is it starting to attack? So if you go through that and like study it so that you've got a basis, or there are many, many, many different ways that you can bring this into your bodily experience that is not intellectual. It sounds intellectual, but that's the conceptual model. Then we learn how to make it an experiential model. So does that help at all?
Very much. Yes, thanks. It's been a real interesting talk tonight. As I think Phil said, he realized how much he hadn't been doing this.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate this new insight for me.
Sure. Well, me too. We're all part of the same club. Like I watch my own mind a lot, and that's where my talks come from. Like, what's the tendency not to do what you ought to be doing, right? But and this is a little more active way of practicing than actually I think many of us were even taught at the beginning. But I'm really convinced from my own study of the suttas that this is the intention of the historical Buddha. I mean, his intention was that this practice is a practice of inquiry, because that's how we get liberated from suffering, or it's how we construct satisfaction and happiness in our life. and those things are active, so. Okay, so I'll just do a really short little metta and dedication here, and then don't jump off because there's going to be a few announcements. Okay, so yeah, I want to thank all of you for your willingness to at least consider these thoughts tonight, and may all of us and all beings everywhere, the thing about living in 2021 is that we just know about all the suffering of the world. Where before we suspected it, but now we know it. So may all beings everywhere experience at least some measure of satisfaction and happiness, and begin to slowly experience less suffering in their life. And may our intention and our effort tonight to explore this contribute, the merit of that contribute to that effort. Okay, so thank you very much.